Haters and gentle friends, welcome to That Final Girl Life. It's your favourite final girl here, taking you through the horrors and out the other side to find out what life is really like after the movie ends. I can't believe I need to say this, but apparently it's a whole thing now. I am an actual real-life human being, not an AI. I physically write all my scripts. I watch the movies at least twice before I do an episode on them. Any resources I use, like other people's articles which I've found helpful, will be in the show notes. There's a lot for this film. In this episode, we'll be discussing the film my best friend called Demented and Excellent, prompting me to ask her to make sure that's what appears on my gravestone. Its batshit, brutal and yet beloved final girl Nikki has been a popular request over the last couple of weeks, so here we go. Please be aware that there will be spoilers throughout the episode. In this episode, I'll be talking about controlling relationships, sexual assault, rape within relationships, coercive control, borderline personality disorder, the patriarchy, secure mental institutions, violent murders, and of course, PTSD. Ready? Duct tape the door closed and ignore the puddle on the carpet as we snuggle up very, very close together to watch Obsession. We begin with a scene in a diner. Timid boy Bear is practicing how to ask out his friend Nikki. It's not going well. Arriving home from this failed rehearsal, he finds his cat dead on the floor. He's not having a good day, but he can't resist going out to meet his friends when Nikki calls and asks him to. On the way, he stops off at a witchy shop to buy her a present. He's planning to replace a crystal necklace she's just lost, but instead he ends up buying a one-wish willow, which, like your average person, he believes is just a joke gift which purports to grant you a wish. Following drinks and a quiz, he drives Nikki back to her place. Parked up outside, he tries to tell her he likes her, but can't get the words out. Frustrated with himself, once she's gone inside, he breaks open the one-wish willow and makes a wish. I wish Nikki Freeman loved me more than anyone in the fucking world. And all of a sudden, there she is, silhouetted in front of the door she'd just entered, stock still, back outside. Bear's a bit freaked out. Nikki comes back to the car. You said you had something for me? Bear covers. Oh, I left it at home. Nikki starts acting very strangely, seemingly coming on to him, inviting him in, then apologising, then getting back in his car, crying, asking to go to his place, telling him she doesn't want to be alone, that her dad is dying. Bear doesn't know what to do, but he ends up driving Nikki back to his place. He sets her up in his bed, tells her to take all the space and time she needs, and heads to the living room. So far, so good. But then Nikki asks if he'll sleep with her, because she won't be able to fall asleep if she's on her own. He agrees, and when he gets into bed, she starts kissing him. Despite knowing she's acting out of character, he kisses her back, and then she freaks out. Yells, jumps backwards, falls off the bed. Bear also freaks out. Nikki apologises. You kissed me, Bear points out desperately. I know I did, Nikki agrees. Bear sleeps on the floor, or tries to. At one point he gets up and searches online for information about one-wish willows. The results that come up include a comment about the Berenstain Bears, hinting that there might be some kind of Mandela effect going on. When he turns back from the computer, Nikki is sitting upright in bed. It's dark, so he can't see her properly, but she seems to be staring at him. He says he was getting water, then gets into bed with her. In the morning, she's made him breakfast. How nice! But, oh no. What's that? It's his dead cat Sandy, lying on the kitchen floor, surrounded by little candles and flowers. There's even a card. Nikki is distraught that Bear doesn't love the memorial she's made. Bear is visibly scared, but acts as normally as possible given the situation, and they go to work. They both work at a music store owned by their friend Sarah's dad. Sarah also works there, and so does Bear's friend Ian, who was with him in the opening scene when he was practicing how to ask out Nikki. Bear tells Ian that Nikki has been acting weirdly. Ian suggests that she might have been on MDMA. Later, after work, a knock on Bear's door reveals Nikki standing on the porch, all dressed up. She apologises, says she was on MDMA and wasted. The lighting in this scene gives her eyes an uncanny glittering effect. Bear asks if she remembered what happened the night before. I'm not saying you took advantage of me, she says, and Bear freaks out. I didn't. I know, that's what I'm saying, you didn't. She tells him she has feelings for him, asks if he feels the same. He says he does. It should be a nice scene, but it's weird. They get together. There's a cutesy montage of them doing all the coupley things, cooking, kissing, showing each other Instagram posts. And then we see them on a date. They're at a nice restaurant, having a sweet conversation about how Bear hasn't decided what he wants to do yet, but might become a food critic. Bear's phone rings. He ignores it. It rings again. Sorry, he says, it might be important. It's Ian, who tells Bear that Nikki's dad isn't dying. He's checked. Bear goes back to the table, asks Nikki if her dad is really dying. And thus we arrive at probably the most memed scene in the movie. Nikki freaks out, stamps her foot, whining, toddler style, yelling. Bear immediately backtracks. Nikki sits back down. They continue the date, presumably kind of awkwardly. Cut to later on in bed. They're having sex. Well, more like Bear's fucking Nikki. He's on top, she's lying under him, empty-eyed and staring into the distance. She's making vaguely sexual noises, but in a rote, monotonous way, like she's a doll with a voice box. Bear either doesn't notice that she's not really into it, or just doesn't care. And then we have my personal favourite scene in the film, given that I'm currently studying the concept of the uncanny. Bear wakes up suddenly. It's 3:45 a.m. Nikki isn't in bed. He looks around the room, trying to make out shapes in the darkness. A voice. Go back to sleep. Nikki's in the corner. She doesn't look like herself. Bear tries to get her to come back to bed, but once again the childlike tone comes back. I don't like my dreams, Nikki sobs. She feels like Bear doesn't love her enough. After she's calmed down a bit, Bear lies back down, turns onto his side, tries to go to sleep. I thought you loved me! The scream echoes around the room. Bear sits bolt upright. Nikki's not in the corner anymore. Where the hell is she? Oh, there she is, doing a weird sideways crab walk back into the room, holding a vase of pink roses up so they completely obscure her face. She stands next to the bed. There's a feeling that she's staring at Bear, even though we can't see her eyes. Suddenly, calmly, she says, For Sandy, okay? Places the flowers on the bedside table, gets into bed, and snuggles up to Bear as if everything is perfectly normal. Bear tries to subtly shift away. Stay! Bear stays. In the morning, Bear tries to have a conversation with Nikki about acceptable nighttime behaviour, which he feels hers wasn't. She promises, super promises, in fact, that there will be no more weird stuff. Bear is relieved, but when he stands up to leave for work, he finds the door has been duct taped shut. He manages to wrench it open and leaves, while Nikki stands watching him with an uncanny smile. The camera stays on her as we hear the sound of dripping water. She's pissing on the carpet. At work, he opens the lunch Nikki has packed for him while he chats to Sarah, who visibly is very into him. According to Bear, his lunchbox contains several inside jokes which Nikki has left for him to find. My little food critic, says a post-it note. You, written on one Polaroid photo. Another one shows Nikki smiling oddly at the camera. Not me is written along the bottom. What's the verdict on cat? Sarah asks, finding another note and puzzled about what it could mean. Bear throws up in the bin. Nikki has cooked the cat. Ian gets a ride home with Bear and asks him what is going on with Nikki. Bear insists Nikki is fine. Ian, like the rest of us, knows he's lying. It's awkward. After he drops Ian off, Bear calls the number on the back of the One Wish willow box. He asks if he can alter his wish. The representative leads him through a confusing conversation in which it becomes clear that Bear is stuck with his wish until he dies. He asks what has happened to Nikki. Do you want to talk to her? Asks the person on the phone. Horrible screaming commences. Who's that? Asks Bear, frightened. Nikki, replies the rep. Bear hangs up. Back home, Bear opens the door, turns the light on, and turns around to find Nikki standing in the same spot he left her. She's the same, but different. Squelchier. She's covered in her own vomit. Once she's showered, Bear takes Nikki to a party at Ian's. It does not go well. She reads a very creepy story about Hansel and Gretel having incestuous sex with each other, having been trained to do so by their grandmother. And then she gets even weirder, until eventually she's sitting next to Bear, stroking him, when all of a sudden she freaks the fuck out, jumps across the room away from him, breaks a bottle on the table, and starts hitting herself on the head with it. "It's not me!" she screams. Bear takes her to the emergency room, but they won't do anything to help. So he takes her back home, where he tells her she needs to start acting normally. "I'll be anything you want me to be," she tells Bear, crying. But he doesn't want that. He wants her to be Nikki, and he wants Nikki to love him. "I love you in every reality, Bear," she says, and he replies that he loves her too. At which point she jumps up and walks backwards in a manner so creepy I can't actually describe it, you'll have to go look for yourself. She's saying, "Rail my guts," but it's so distorted it's almost impossible to work out. Bear is terrified. Nikki stops in the doorway. "I would never hurt you," she tells him, but then lunges forward, stops. Bear looks like he's about to piss himself. He says he'll go and sleep at Ian's. Nikki says that's fine, but then describes bleeding out and dying in bed alone. Bear stays. Later on, in bed, Bear gets a text from Sarah, who wants him to meet her in the park. Creeping out of the bedroom, he stops in his tracks as Nikki stirs. Still asleep, Nikki talks to him. "Kill me, please. It's me. Please don't wake her up. Just kill me." "What's so bad about being with me?" Bear asks. "I've never been with you, Bear. Just kill me, please." Bear leaves without killing Nikki and goes to meet Sarah in the park. They discuss the fact that Sarah has a crush on Bear, something which has been obvious throughout the movie. We can guess what's coming, but even so, the suddenness with which Nikki bursts through the car window during their conversation and bashes Sarah's head in with a brick still manages to be shocking. This is horrifying, obviously, but it's done in such a way that I think most seasoned horror fans will find it funny. Either that or I've finally turned into a total psychopath. Sarah is very, very dead. The next morning, Bear goes back to the shop where he bought the one-wish willow. They sell him 2 more, warning him that he can't have a second wish, but adding that if he can get someone else to make the wish he wants, then perhaps that will work. Bear goes to see Ian and tries to tell him about the wish. Understandably, Ian doesn't believe him. He wishes facetiously for $1 billion, which immediately rains down on him while Bear sinks to his knees looking utterly defeated. Back at home, Bear finds a shrine Nikki has made, along with Sarah's corpse, which is spread out in a sexually suggestive position on a chair. Except it's not sexy because she has no face and is covered in blood. As is Nikki, who appears in the room inexpertly smoking a cigarette and with new tattoos on her arm. She's trying to be like Sarah. It's not subtle. Nikki begins fighting with herself. Wish Nikki sounds almost mechanical. Real Nikki sounds utterly desperate. At one point, Ian appears and Nikki shoots him dead. It happens so quickly it's almost possible to miss it. She turns her attention back to Bear. I love you, Bear insists, terrified. "I knew you did." Nikki, quietened, sits down next to him and snuggles up close. She looks like an anime character. After a few moments, Bear makes a dash for the bathroom and locks himself in. There's only one way out of this situation, he knows. He has the gun in his hand, but he can't bring himself to shoot himself. Instead, he opens his grandmother's medicine cabinet and swallows a bunch of pills. In the background, we hear another one-wish willow go off. Bear stops swallowing pills and tries to make himself throw up. Then he opens the bathroom door and stands in the living room, staring at Nikki, looking utterly besotted. Nikki, we are led to understand, has wished that Bear would love her the same way she loves him. And it has worked. He moves towards her. They embrace. But then Bear falls to the ground. He didn't manage to get rid of the overdose. He dies in Nikki's arms. And then real Nikki switches back, looks around her, sees the carnage, and begins to cry. I saw a thread on Reddit in which the poster said they hoped Nikki would grab the billions and flee at the end of the movie. They actually had a pretty interesting outline for a sequel too, although personally I'd rather leave this as a standalone. Annoyingly, I can't seem to find the thread now, but if you know which one I'm talking about, please send it to me and I'll link it in the show notes. Realistically, unfortunately, I don't think that's what Nikki would do. She's just come round from some pretty horrific dissociative episodes and discovered that she's killed all her friends. Her life is in tatters around her. Bear's just died in her arms. So what's likely to happen next? First of all, let's talk about the psychological interpretation of the events of the movie. In real life, most of us don't have access to magical wish-granting trinkets, and it's obvious that the One-Wish Willow is just a convenient setup for a movie that's really about unhealthy relationships, control, and abuse. The first time I watched Obsession, I wasn't sure if I liked it. Not because I thought it was badly made, I was immediately impressed by it on a cinematic level, but because I wasn't totally sure what the director's intentions were. I felt that whether I came down pro or anti-obsession rested on whether some of the movie's themes, which were obvious to me as a therapist, were there deliberately or just there by accident. I felt this would also speak to whether Nikki or Bear was supposed to be the more villainous character, which wasn't immediately obvious to me, especially during the first half of the film. So I watched it a second time, again noticing the themes, and then I looked up some interviews with the director, but I couldn't find anything about the specific psychological features I'd been after. So I decided to Google them directly, and reading the things that came up as a result of that not only completely sold me on the movie, but also led to some pretty harrowing realizations about some of my own prior relationships. The main thing I wanted to find out was whether Nikki's behaviours throughout the movie were deliberately evocative of BPD. BPD, or borderline personality disorder, is a psychiatric diagnosis which is frequently given to young women. Some people call it the modern-day hysteria, not because they think people with BPD are hysterical, but because they feel it plays a similar role in society to the one hysteria played 100 or so years ago. If there's a woman who's evidently going through a great deal of psychological distress and suffering, rather than bothering to find out what's wrong and helping her to deal with it, it's much easier to slap a label on her and therefore let society view her as less than. BPD is frequently viewed as a problematic diagnosis, not only for this reason, but also because its definition is very broad. The DSM-5, the current version of the manual that tells psychiatrists what to diagnose their patients with, says that for a person to be diagnosed with BPD, they must exhibit 5 of the following 9 symptoms. 1. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. 2. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. 3. Identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. 4. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, such as spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. 5. Recurrent suicidal behaviour, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behaviour. 6. Affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood, which basically means mood swings, but very strong ones. 7. Chronic feelings of emptiness. 8. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. And 9. Transient, stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. Depending on which 5 of these a person has, their behaviour and overall way of being can look very different from someone else with the same diagnosis. These 9 listed items also correlate strongly with having been traumatised in general, so a lot of people view BPD as a way for psychiatrists to pathologise the victims of trauma rather than its perpetrators. The DSM is an ongoing work within psychiatry, and there are a few extra criteria which have been proposed for inclusion in the next version. This doesn't mean they will be added, but it does mean that enough psychiatrists have submitted them for it to be a possibility for the DSM-6. The proposed additions are an unstable self-image and instability of goals, interpersonal relationships and affect. Here, affect means feelings. Impulsivity and risk-taking behaviours. Hostility. Difficulties with regard to identity, self-direction, empathy or intimacy. Maladaptive traits in the domain of negative affectivity, which I haven't looked into in loads of depth, but it sounds like psych speak for when you feel bad, the way you cope with it isn't helpful to you. And finally, antagonism and or disinhibition. Listening to both of those lists, you can probably see why as a psychotherapist my mind immediately went to BPD when I saw how Nikki was behaving in her relationship. Now, it's worth saying that the vast majority of people with BPD will not exhibit behaviours anywhere near as extreme as Nikki's. This is a horror film, after all, so everything needs to be overblown because that's the kind of audience it's catering to. In real life, people with BPD don't tend to bash people to death with bricks, shoot their friends dead, or slam broken bottles against their faces repeatedly whilst at chill parties. However, the vibe of Nikki very much has a BPD feel. This was what made me uncomfortable on first viewing. However, having read more about the film and its development, as well as some reactions from online BPD communities, I began to feel much more positive towards it. Curry Barker, the movie's director, has been very upfront about Bear being the villain of the piece. Overall, critics and viewers seem to agree with this, though there are some exceptions and nuances. In an interview with Time magazine, Barker explained, "The moment you're supposed to realise Bear 100% knows what's going on is at the restaurant when he asks her point blank, 'You love me more than anyone in the world?' which was the exact wording of his wish." Siddhant Sadlaka wrote a thoughtful review which pointed out that Nikki's demeanour is, at its core, an echo of Bear's own intentions, reflected back to him by the most disquieting of human shapes. In other words, Bear is deliberately controlling Nikki, even if he set out not realising that. It's possible to make some excuses for him during the first half of the film, to different extents depending on your views about consent, but by the time the restaurant scene happens, and especially after he's called the One Wish Willow helpline, Bear is very much in a controlling relationship. And whilst he might feel like his life is the one spiralling out of control, actually it's Nikki who is really suffering. Which brings us back to BPD and other real-life psychiatric diagnoses. One of the criticisms of the entire psychiatric industry is that it often pathologizes the people who are suffering, which leads to them being othered and ultimately suffering even more. What do I mean by that? Well, think about the events of obsession. Imagine they played out exactly as they did on screen. Someone's going to have called the police at some point, and they're going to arrive at Bear's house and find Nikki covered in blood, sobbing and shaking uncontrollably. Bear is dead of an overdose at her feet. Ian is dead of a gunshot wound inflicted by the gun Nikki has just put down next to her. And Sarah is splayed out suggestively, drenched in her own blood. They're also going to find the shrine Nikki made and the video of Bear sleeping which was playing on the TV while they were making out. If the police don't just immediately shoot Nikki dead on sight, a pretty big if, although she has more of a chance because she's not black, if they take a second to pause and look around, they're probably going to quickly come to the conclusion that this woman is not okay. How they treat her might not be any different. Unfortunately, police in the US as well as elsewhere are known to treat people who are in mental health crisis badly, and even violently. One of my close friends died by suicide back in 2014, partly as a result of this happening to her. But if they manage to get her into custody without too many things going wrong, and they get her a lawyer and clean her up, they'll quickly see that Nikki is in a huge state of shock. One thing we as viewers don't know for sure is whether real Nikki still has all the memories of Wish Nikki once she's switched back. The events of the film lead us to believe she probably does though. For example, in the scene where Bear is sneaking out to talk to Sarah, real Nikki pleads with him to kill her, and she seems aware that the person in control of her body is not her, and she seems also to be aware of some of the things that person has done. Split personalities are usually a problematic trope in cinema, but this one works well, I think, mostly because we understand that the split is happening because of Bear's actions, not because Nikki has a secret evil side or is just quote-unquote crazy. If I go into the details of various personality splits, then this episode is going to be about 3 hours long, so I won't. But if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know and I might turn it into a bonus. So the police have Nikki and they're questioning her. Even if she's retained all the memories of what happened while she was Wish Nikki, she's unlikely to be able to coherently lay it out. Even if she does tell them what actually happened, they're hardly going to believe her. This is another strong parallel with survivors of trauma in general. We spoke in the first episode about how difficult it is for people to talk about traumatic experiences with anybody, let alone with law enforcement agents in an interrogative context. Some of that, of course, is about the power dynamics and the fact that the police are frankly terrifying, especially in the US. But some of it also is to do with people not believing you. Plenty of people haven't believed me when I've said things about my childhood, and that was what I found most damaging for years. It compounded the trauma to be told that that sort of thing doesn't happen when it very much does. Now, my childhood didn't involve anyone making a magic wish and causing me to fall in love with them, but I have no doubt that Nikki will face a similar dynamic with the police. she'll be viewed as psychotic or a fantasist, depending on who the on-call psych is. I had to look up what would most likely happen next because I'm from the UK, and also I've never committed mass murder and been interrogated about it by a police psychiatrist. I found a really good podcast called Beyond Prisons, which has a recent series called Incarceration, talking about some of the problems with the carceral system in the US, especially with regard to mental health care. I've put links to the episodes I listened to whilst thinking about obsession in the show notes, but I'd really recommend listening to the whole series. It was so informative. The podcast hosts also run the Instagram account No New Washington Prisons, which you can also find linked in the show notes. They campaign for prison abolition and positive social change. They're well worth checking out. What I learned from listening, and any errors I make in this description will be mine and not theirs, is that often, if someone has committed a serious crime but is visibly mentally unwell, they will be put into a secure state psychiatric facility while they wait to be deemed competent to stand trial. Obsession is based in California, which means Nikki is likely to be sent somewhere like Patton State Hospital. I did try to find reports from people who had stayed there, but I couldn't find any. The podcast is based in Washington, so I apologise for any interstate inaccuracies, but I'm doing the best I can as a British person. Nikki would be in the state hospital until one of two things happen. Either she's deemed competent to stand trial, or the case against her is dismissed. What is meant by competent to stand trial has nothing to do with whether the person is mentally well. Rather, it's whether they're able to basically understand what is going on in a courtroom and conduct themselves in a reasonably human-like manner while the trial is going on. This might be achieved with medication, which can be given by force, as well as classes that teach people how courtrooms work. They're then evaluated to decide whether to continue with prosecution. I think there's a pretty good chance that Nikki will be deemed competent. We didn't see much of her before Wish Nikki took over, but there were several things that indicated she was probably doing okay. She had a job, she had friends, as far as we could tell she had no substance abuse issues, she was kind to the homeless man outside the bar they went to. There are, however, also things that point to her life not always having been rosy. She's estranged from her dad. Given how carefully the movie was written, I expect this might be indicative of some familial abuse in her past. The story she reads during the party, about an incestuous relationship between a brother and sister who are taught to be that way by the old lady who's looking after them, adds credence to this. So do the scenes where she speaks like a child. Often people who have had significant negative events in childhood will revert to behaving like they are the age it happened when they're in a disturbed psychological state. The line I found the most disturbing in the entire film was, "I don't like my dreams," not because of the uncanny makeup, though that was fantastic, but because it was so evocative of things I've seen in my work as a therapist from people who are in states of extreme distress. I'd be willing to bet that if you ask the psychologists and therapists you know whether there's a link between childhood sexual abuse and BPD, most of them would say yes. A meta-analysis from back in the 1990s actually saw no significant correlation between child sexual abuse and BPD, but there have been two major systematic reviews since then, which both show that the correlation is strong. I wonder whether this has to do with more people being willing to report sexual abuse than they were in the 90s. I'm not sure, but the current data demonstrate that there is a correlation. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who's been diagnosed with BPD has a history of sexual abuse. Likewise, not everyone who's been sexually abused has a history of BPD. While I was preparing for this episode, I read a really interesting study looking at how the specific conditions people are diagnosed with can have an impact on how they're treated, even if a lot of the symptoms are the same. Specifically, the study compared BPD with CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is also strongly correlated with childhood sexual abuse. But CPTSD doesn't have the same stigma attached to it as BPD, so those of us who have that diagnosis, and I am in that group, tend to have an easier time interacting with police, psychiatrists and medical professionals than our BPD friends. Which is not to say we have it easy either, the stories I could tell you. But there's a relative lack of privilege for folks with a diagnosis of BPD, which Nikki, given her specific behaviours while she was Wish Nikki, is almost certain to be diagnosed with over CPTSD. That was a bit of a tangent, but it also provides some information about Nikki's potential history, which in turn will influence how things work out for her moving forward. Let's say she's deemed competent to stand trial, does so, and then during the trial the jury decide she's not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. I think there's enough evidence to warrant that, not only from Nikki's actions, but also from the people around her. Sarah's dad, their friends at the party, the ER nurse who saw her in the car, and so on. So Nikki stood trial with a BPD diagnosis newly on her record, has told a courtroom that she was under the influence of a magical wish, has been described as psychotic by witnesses on the stand, this being a word that was used by the characters in the movie, and has been deemed not guilty by reason of insanity by a jury. What happens to her now? Well, she'd probably remain in the psych ward of the state hospital. Something that surprised me from the podcast I listened to was that people who are deemed incompetent or not guilty, but still require psychiatric care within a facility, are often returned to the exact same room where they'd been waiting for trial, and they're just there now, which presumably would feel like an ongoing punishment. The hosts interviewed people who are currently incarcerated, some of whom mentioned that being on a psych ward feels worse than being in prison. They also described what happens when you exhibit suicidal feelings. You're stripped naked, given a smock, your commissary is taken away, and you're led to a completely bare room with a cold concrete floor and kept there until you no longer seem suicidal. I don't know about you, but that's a set of conditions that sounds like it'd quickly have me wanting to die. Once you're inside the forensic psychiatric system, it's difficult to get out. You'll be assigned a therapist, but like with anything, it's very much the luck of the draw whether you get one who's good or one who has no idea how to treat you like a person. Nikki would probably struggle with this, in part because of how wild her story sounds. So she'll be having a really difficult time, to put it mildly. However, I do think that given what we know of her personality, she'll probably be making the best of it. She'd been wanting a break from work to write, and now she's got one. I mean, maybe she kind of got her wish too, and as fucked up a way as Bear got his. I reckon she'd continue writing. Maybe she remembers the awful but well-written story Wish Nikki read out at the party, and carries it on. Maybe she writes about what's happened to her, and wants to sell it as a fantasy novel. Maybe she starts writing the script for a movie. Who knows? I actually think there's a pretty good chance that Nikki might one day get out. She's polite, well-mannered and kind, educated and eloquent. All of those things work in her favour. She's Latina, which might work against her, but she's not black, so she's not at the bottom of the pecking order in the US carceral system. I think she'd also be socially savvy enough, once she's out of the initial period of shock and horror, to walk the thin line between not befriending any groups and ending up beholding to them, and not pissing the other inmates off by snubbing them. So if and when she gets out, what then? It's not going to be easy. And that's something a lot of us don't think about enough. What happens when you get out of prison? Where do you go? What do you do? Do you get your old stuff back? The answer, of course, is it varies. And it varies relative to all sorts of things. Where the prison's located, where you're from, what kind of a support network you have on the outside, and your overall level of privilege, to name just a few. In general, when you get out of prison, you're starting from the bottom. If Nikki thought she was at the bottom before because she was estranged from her family and working a job she wasn't passionate about, she's now going to have an unpleasant surprise. She's probably used to those by now, and they might have turned her a bit jaded. Nikki doesn't have any family that we know of. There's an implication that her mother is dead when she gives Bear the necklace, and we know she's estranged from her father. She doesn't have any friends because she's killed them all. And she's hardly going to be offered her old job back at the music shop after she murdered the proprietor's daughter. Okay, so what does Nikki have going for her? What options might she have? We know she's a writer and a creative thinker. We know she's able, or at least used to be able, to hold down a job. We know she's likeable, funny, and kind. When she's released from prison, she's very unlikely to get her old place back. We don't know how she came to be living there, but given the lack of explanation, it's probably rented. Which means she'll be homeless, which means if she's lucky, she'll end up in a hostel. I say lucky because it's probably better than sleeping on the street, but hostels are not fun places to live. I know that because I've lived in them. We were homeless when I was very young, and I don't remember much about it, but I do remember that homeless hostels were not exactly sanctuaries. They were, however, at the very least, a bit of shelter. So she's in a hostel. She has barely any belongings. A lot of the other residents are loud, on drugs, fighting all the time. It's very unsafe. She's likely to be assaulted while she's there. But she's pretty tenacious, and she's probably learned some things in prison, so let's say she manages to keep herself together enough to get a job. Anything will do to get her out of the hostel, so she takes whatever she's first offered and sticks at it until she's able to rent something small of her own. She breathes a sigh of relief. She's out, in her own space, with a lockable door that no one else can open. Amazing. But then the honeymoon period wears off, and it turns out she's still in the job she took in desperation when she was released. She can't get another job because nobody wants to hire someone with a criminal record, except the kind of place she's already working in. Not only does she have a criminal record, she also has a psychiatric one. I feel like I need to give you a more positive ending than the one I gave last time, because even though it's realistic that final girls' lives often don't turn out for the best, I do understand that you're probably here for the success stories. And actually, even though the odds are very much stacked against her, I can see Nikki fighting on, writing alongside her dead-end job, exhausted for sure, sometimes despairing and hopeless, sometimes maybe on the verge of suicidal again. But Nikki has some stuff to say, and she knows how to say it. So maybe she works her way through, edits some of the stuff she wrote in prison, gets it published. Perhaps traditionally, because what a story. Or maybe she posts it online, builds up a Patreon. Probably she'd use some of what she earns to help others in similar positions. I can see Nikki building a pretty nice little life for herself. Not a perfect one, no, but whose is? Enough of a life to be enough, though. Eventually she can probably quit the job she doesn't like and write full-time. Kinda dreamy, no? She'll struggle with various different things for the rest of her life. Her conviction will follow her everywhere. So will her diagnosis, so will her nightmares. She'll be sensitive to random things, probably reluctant to get into any kind of serious relationship, probably even afraid of making friends. Anytime something goes slightly wrong in a relationship, she'll feel like she's jinxed, like she's somehow the cause of all these cursed events that happen with her at the centre. It won't actually be her fault, but it'll feel so much like it that it'll make her draw back, hide, push people away from her. Then sometimes she'll feel such a yearning for connection that it'll be too strong to resist, and she'll overcome her fear and find a friend or romantic partner, and then freak out and back away again. Does that sound familiar? It's very similar to some of the BPD behaviours we talked about earlier. Because Nikki is as likely to end up with a psychiatric diagnosis as a result of the things that have happened to her as she was to start out with one. But she's a writer, and writers often get pretty used to their own company, so maybe she gradually just builds a life around that. Something that made me feel sad for Nikki when I was trying to imagine her future life is that I think she'd struggle to have a pet. I'm a recluse by nature, much prefer my own company to the company of humans, but without my cat? I don't know if I'd want to carry on. Nikki, for obvious reasons, might find it too upsetting to even contemplate getting a pet. So she's very alone. She probably had some characteristics that made her like that in the first place, but the parts of her that wanted to connect with other people will feel unfulfilled. After a while, though, she might find a certain amount of connection through voluntary work. Once she's set herself up nicely with her from-home writing job and her quiet little apartment, I can imagine her going to volunteer at a women's prison or a psych facility. Something where she can show she cares for people, but within strict boundaries and without too much in the way of sharing personal details. I don't think she's likely to be a runaway success as a writer. She'd have too much trouble with things like doing the interview circuit while she's marketing her book. And I very much doubt she'd end up with the life she wanted before she went to prison. But she might be able to make a nice enough life for herself out of what remains. And I guess that's kind of the point of this podcast, to show that final girls do survive, by definition. At the very least, they survive the events of their movie. And some of us, myself included, end up with lives that are much better and look much more normal than most people might expect. Yet still, we are fundamentally changed from what we would have been otherwise. And that's, well, not okay exactly, but it's just part of life, isn't it? When I'm feeling particularly miserable about my final girl status and how it's impacted my life, I like to reread Viktor Frankl's books. Man's Search for Meaning, about the time he spent in concentration camps during the Holocaust, and Yes to Life in Spite of Everything, a series of lectures he gave to trainee psychiatrists about how important it is for people to be able to find meaning in life. I reckon Nikki's creative and tenacious enough to find some meaning amongst the ashes. But what do you think? Obsession was directed by Curry Barker and came out in 2025. Our final girl Nikki was played by the queen of uncanny facial expressions, Inde Navarrette. You can follow the podcast on Instagram @ThatFinalGirlLife, or support us on patreon.com/thatfinalgirllife. The free tier gets you 2 episodes a month, the paid tier gets you 4. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, you can email them to thatfinalgirllife@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember, the horrors persist, but so do we.